Our top story tonight, how should the country reopen? With us right now is the former Democratic presidential candidate, John Delaney, also the former Minnesota Governor, Tim Pawlenty. Gentlemen, it's good to have you with us for our top story this evening. Governor, I begin with you. We heard the president tonight. He's going to make an announcement, he says, tomorrow. We don't have enough testing yet. We're not even close, yet we are moving towards a reopening. Are we, Governor, making a mistake?
Well, of course, Scott, this is like the proverbial balancing test of physical health versus economic health. And it's like trying to catch a falling knife. Too early or too little can cause a lot of problems. But what we're beginning to see at a regional and state level is the elements of guidelines or a roadmap that would include expanded testing, more contact tracing, isolating those infected, protecting the most at risk, ensuring the healthcare system isn't overwhelmed, distancing within the workplace, and then being ready to reinstate if things don't go well. It's too early now, I think, but we got to at least get ready for a situation where those elements can be in place. In my view, that's probably into May.
Congressman, are we ready?
Well, I think the governor's right. This is a regional decision, first of all, because obviously the virus is playing out very differently across this country. And I think that we can't open today, but there are parts of the country that can probably begin to reopen in a very, what I would describe as kind of a very gentle glide path starting in May, where you could see office workers starting to go back into the office because you can social distance there, and you could see some small shops and things that don't particularly get crowded reopening. But we have to get used to masks and gloves because I think that's going to be a very common thing in the early phases of reopening.
Governor, talk us through this. How do you try and get a state up and running again while at the same time knowing that you're taking a big risk? The worst thing you want to have happen is to reopen and then have to shut down again. That would be even more devastating for the economy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, of course, there is going to be some risk, Scott. We shouldn't sugarcoat it. No matter whether you try to reopen in increments or try to reopen sooner or later, our leaders should look us in the eye and say, we're going to try this, but let's all understand there is some risk. And things could go, in a negative direction that would require us to rein it back in. But I want to underscore something Congressman Delaney said, which is you can't do any of this until you have quick, easily accessible, ubiquitous testing available, including potentially at the workplace. And we're not there yet.
Well, Governor, we're not going to be there by the time the president wants to reopen either. So how do we handle that? We're not going to be ready for mass testing to test every single person who walks into an office building on May 1st.
But even now, Scott, you could look around and say the standard isn't just essential. It's either essential or things that can be done safely. So, for example, it's not one size fits all. In Minnesota, there's a lot more cases in urban areas than remote rural counties. So there's some geographic differentiation you could do. And then secondly, things like outdoor work. I mean, if you're a landscaper, if you're dealing with the boating industry, golf courses aren't the most important thing, but done correctly, they could be open. And I could go down the list of things that could be done incrementally. You don't need it all a one big bang opening. It could be done in a measured way.
Congressman, there are those who say, look, we have to get the economy reopened. That's what we do. We have to do it sooner rather than later, and the reward is worth the risk. Do you agree?
Well, listen, we've become very bad at trade-offs in our country. We talk about everything in absolute terms. I think that you've got to be prudent. You've got to look at the science. I think it's incredibly important to make sure the healthcare system in whatever area you start reopening is in a condition to handle the increase in cases that are likely to happen. Because, listen, as the governor said, we are likely to have some spike when we start reopening. We all hope those spikes are gentle. We all are going to think about the things we need to do to make sure they're gentle. But you can't take that risk unless you have a healthcare system that has the capacity. So, for example, if you look at San Francisco's healthcare system and the number of people on ventilators and the excess ventilators they have, and you compare it to New York, for example, two large cities, there's a clear difference in the capacity of the systems to handle an uptick if you reopen. So what that means is San Francisco, for example, can, put its toe in the water on reopening because if there is a spike in cases, the healthcare system can handle it. Whereas in New York right now, that's much harder to do. So you have to look at some of the things that will mitigate the risk of an inevitable spike in cases when you reopen. So that's also an important component of this. And if you have that, I think you can start doing things, yeah.
Governor, how closely do other governors need to work with business leaders and CEOs on this issue? And what if they come back and say, sir, we're just not ready. We're afraid that if we say show up for work, our employees won't.
Yeah, very, very important point, Scott. And I think governors across the country are clearly working with CEOs. The Business Roundtable, by the way, which is of course, the umbrella group for the largest companies in the country, came out with a guideline or a roadmap back to reopening. But one thing I think your question suggests is this. It's one thing for a politician to say we're back open. It's another thing for people to actually believe it and do it. And to some extent, this is going to self-regulate because if somebody says we're back open, I think there's a lot of people who aren't going to be very eager to go around more than a couple people at a pretty safe distance. And so no matter what the politicians say, there's going to be some self-regulation around just how people react to that.
Gentlemen, we appreciate your time very much tonight.
And also, just one thing to add, people who are vulnerable, this is not going to reopen for them for a long time until there's treatment or ultimately a vaccine.